My name is Michaela Kreinfeld. I'm from the Hertie School, and it's my very great pleasure to be the chair of the session of Frank Kalter, who we very much warmly welcome here in this digital world. I think there's no need at all to introduce Frank in this audience, but nevertheless, let me say he's a professor of Mannheim University at Mannheim University, and last week we had Irena Kogan here, so it's a really clustering of Mannheim events here in virtual Berlin. And he's also head of DeZIM, and I think I would waste a lot of time mentioning all the activities and all the publications he has been involved in the last year. So I don't want to waste time and give the floor to Frank to give a presentation on social network analysis and the micro link in integration research. And I'm already looking forward to the presentation and also the discussion. We have really excellent and large number of people in the audience, and I think that will be very enjoyable. So the floor is all yours, Frank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michaela. Thank you for you and Christian and the others for organizing this, which I think is really a great idea and a great seminar. And when Christian asked me whether I could contribute to this, there was no doubt at all that I immediately agreed. So we'll do my best. Christian, when we talked, asked me that maybe, or kind of suggested that it might be a good idea to present something on the social network analysis, where many of my research assistants, but also I myself have done a little bit in the past, and that I happily took this idea up and tried to present something which is not really one research paper. So the basic will be one paper. That's a very recent paper that I did with Tom Snyder's, which is the gray paper here. But I tried to integrate it a little bit into a longer, more, so that the title already sounds a little bit programmatic, and the talk is kind of programmatic, maybe in a sense, is a mixture of a programmatic and methodological contribution. And I've tried to embed it a little bit into a longer programmatic story that kind of starts with a paper that Clemens and so it's really great to have you here, started 2014. And then I will mention a contribution with Hanno Kruse, who is also here. So I have a lot of support and help in case I'm struggling. And so the basis, and I hope that this will kind of lead to the paper that I recently did with Tom Snyder's for the Festschrift for Werner Raub, where we tried to make the next step in this more general attempt. So that's also why I want to start very, very general, and because I know that the audience here might be very heterogeneous, so I might talk to some, this is nothing new at all, and to others that might be important maybe to understand the general framing of this talk. So I basically have two starting points. The one is a more general theoretical, sociological theoretical starting point that starts from the idea of whatever you call it. Some call it analytical, some call it explanatory, some now call it rigorous sociology, which stresses next to many other virtues like precision, logical correctness, empirical content. Or it's a kind of reminder that sociology is still about, in the end, social phenomena in the Durkheimian sense. That means sociology is about explaining macro phenomena in the end, so that the basic task is to explain social situations 1 out of social situations 0. And we also know this Coleman boat, the micro scheme, the program of methodological individualism, that's the way around, that this is best done by referring explicitly to actors, how social situations influence actors, how actors choose behavior. That's hinted at this so-called Coleman vote, or the macro-macro scheme, or the scheme of sociological explanation, whatever you call it. And in this article, together with Clemens, we at that time wrote and thought that this whole stressing of the idea of analytical sociology is also, next to these other virtues, a reminder that we should more care explicitly about the whole steps in this procedure, that most research, empirical research, is basically the standard survey research is basically about the red parts of the endeavor here, how situations influence actors, how actors choose their behavior, that there is not so much emphasis on the transformation problem, on the problem of non-trivial aggregation, the sociological phenomenon of emergence, however you call that. And we said, okay, this trend, or this fashion, or whatever of analytical sociology is the strong part of it, that is a reminder that sociology is also about this green step here, how behavior aggregates to social phenomena, and how this can then be understood in a dynamic way, how we can understand social phenomena by interpreting this as a dynamic social interactive process where situations influence actors, they behave, they change the situation for others, actors, and so on. That's the basic idea. And as we said, the impression was at that time, and still is, that empirical research is very much about these red parts, but not so strongly about these green parts of this endeavor. The other starting point is then the substantive one. In integration research, we also have very wide debates and very general debates on, for example, what the concept of integration is. And we will immediately see how this fits to these general reminders of analytical sociology, that integration is a wide concept. Integration is not something which isn't characteristic only of migrants and their descendants, which is a multi-sided process. That means it's heavily a result of social interactions and not a one-sided investment. And it's at the end also, at least also, and not only an individual characteristic, but also an emergent macro phenomenon. That means that next to individual integration, as I would call it, we also have to address this integration phenomena in sense of macro social phenomena. And we also think that this is not really captured by standard mainstream research and design in the field of integration research. And as the expert know, and others have heard of, there are now fortunately very strong tools to develop this, potentially at least. One strong tool is network analysis, which is in the title, which many of you have worked on, and where I think it is safe to say that we witnessed a really tremendous increase in sophisticated models in the last years. The exponential random graph modeling, which is also more and more used for issues of integration research in the widest sense. Wilma Lewis is a very famous publication. Many publications who use network analysis to address the phenomenon of ethnic homophily, because the virtue of and the advantages of this is that we can, with network analysis, control for opportunity structure. We can account for natural social mechanisms, for so-called balancing mechanisms, some of them which I will refer to later. And we also have the tool of agent-based modeling, which is addressing these red parts of the, and there's explicitly agent-based modeling, which also has become more and more popular in recent years. where the famous role model, the model number one we would all mention, is this model of Schelling on racial segregation, dealing explicitly with integration-related phenomena. But there's it's also safe to say that there are not too many exciting models after Schelling. We still mention Schelling as the model. So there is a lot to be done on this side. And now there are these new network analytical models which have been developed by Tom Snyders and in his research group in the last years, the stochastic actor-oriented models, which kind of are a combination of these two things, which combine network analysis with ideas of agent-based modeling. And that's what the paper will be about, basically, and where I will lead to now. But before I do this, I want to, as I already warned Hanno, that I will refer to this, I want to motivate this by a former study we have done, a previous study that I did together with Hanno Cruz in 2015, where we studied classroom integration and addressed this basic question which was raised famously by Putnam, especially, whether ethnic diversity leads to less integration or social cohesion in societies. And the basic Putnam idea, as there's a nice reconstruction and critique of Portesh and Wikström in the Annual Review of Sociology. And this is basically the Putnam argument is that ethnic diversity should lead or should lead to less social cohesion in sense of network cohesion. And the basic idea, the basic mechanism is homophily, the very fact and the very solid empirical fact that there is a preference for same group actors among almost everybody, whether it is gender or whether it is education or whether ethnicity, and this naturally leads to less social cohesion. That's the traditional classical Putnam question. And we tried to naively, straightforwardly address this with our data from the Children of Immigrants Longitudinal Survey, the SILS for You study, where in the wave number one, we collected rich sociometric information on classrooms in the 4 countries, where each of the students had to nominate, among many other things, the 5 best friends in the classroom. That's the measure we used. And we now analyze these classrooms of our study, which are more than 700 classrooms in total. And what we did really is very straightforward. So what does social cohesion or integration of a classroom mean? There we have in network analysis a large variety, very large repertoire of potentially different measures. Most simple density, measures which are based on reciprocity, measures which are based on transitive closure, and so on. There are a lot of options, in the end, very different concepts of integration that they would operationalize. So we decided to look, for example, at one measure which is based on the general idea of reachability in social networks, the question how good can actors reach other actors in this network, and we operationalized this by looking at the path distance. That means how many steps does one actor in the network need to reach another actor, at least indirectly. And the measure of integration we use is the average inverse path distance now between any of these pairs, as a total measure for integration of these classrooms. And if you look at this example here, where there is no pass at all, This is the infinity sign here. That means the inverse value would be 0. So for this small network here, the cohesion would be 0.37. And just to show you that this makes intuitively sense, just 6 networks of this 700 out of these 700 classrooms we had in our study. You see that this network here, and that is also our intuitive feeling, has a cohesion of 0.05, this 0.14, and so on, growing cohesion here, which fits is face validity for our measure because it fits our impression, which we have from the mere picture here. So that is cohesion or integration now at the classroom level. And what we then did is we looked at how does ethnic diversity now relate to the cohesion measured in these terms. And what we have here now on the x-axis is the ethnic diversity of these classrooms measured by a Herfindahl-based index, so growing ethnic diversity. And we looked how does this correlate simply with the cohesion or the integration of these classrooms in terms of reachability. And what we basically found is that there's almost no correlation at all. So ethnic diversity is not related in our study to social integration, to the degree of social integration of the classroom as a total when we look at this correlation. But we also found that on the other hand, this is surprising because the basic mechanism that Putnam or the reconstruction of Porteous and Wikström suggested, namely ethnic homophily, is widely present in the classrooms. So when we look at homophily, which we can do by network analytical techniques using these exponential random graph model, we can really attach a value for how strongly are network choices or friend choices driven by homophily, net of opportunity structure, and so on. And what we here plotted is this coefficient for ethnic homophily against the ethnic diversity in the classroom. And what we found is a very strong correlation that growing ethnic diversity not only means more ethnic homogeneous friendship choices via opportunity structure, but it also increases the incentive to choose same ethnics. And that is a kind of a puzzle because on the one hand, we have this confirmation of ethnic homophily with ethnic diversity, but on the other hand, it doesn't affect the social cohesion. And then we tried to understand this. And then at that time, we did a very pragmatic analysis here. We just looked in a meta-analysis if we use the classrooms at cases, and if we look now, how do several parameters of our models, of our classroom models, affect the social cohesion of the classroom, then we find that this cohesion in terms of reachability is dependent on some structural parameters, but not so much depending on the ethnic homophily parameter. So whether you have a preference for the same ethnic group does not matter for the cohesion of the classroom. Sex or gender segregation and the gender preference, that matters for the overall social cohesion. The tendency to make triad closure, that means if you have a friend of a friend, that's very likely that you also choose him as a friend. This very fact and this balancing mechanism or this general social mechanism affects social cohesion, but social cohesion is not affected by ethnic preferences or ethnic homophily. So that we said, okay, those things who are important for social cohesion or for a lack of social cohesion. There are things, but these things are not the things which are related, but these are not very strongly related to ethnic diversity. For example, the gender segregation preference is not related to ethnic diversity. This is now the correlation with ethnic diversity. We see, of course, there is a relation with same ethnic group preferences with growing ethnic diversity in the classroom. But this is not important for social cohesion. While the other things who are important for social cohesion are not so much related to ethnic diversity. That was our intuitive explanation. Hanno, correct me if I'm wrong afterwards. That was our interpretation, which is very pragmatic and very, and very straightforward in methodological terms. Where we felt, okay, we think this is true, but there must be a better way to show this and better ways to show this. And this is basically the idea, the general motivation, at least for me, to engage in this paper with Tom Snyders, who was also very interested in following this up. And where we now tried in this paper, Religious Diversity and Social Cohesion, to make this more methodologically sound, or to at least check whether the methods he has developed can come closer to this idea. And that's the paper this is about. What we propose in this paper is a more integrated statistical approach to address this general problem or this general kind of questions, macro questions, and to study this very explicitly with this model. And this model is this stochastic actor-oriented model. And what Tom here was very much interested also to contribute an extension of this model now to a longitudinal and to a random coefficient approach. And that's what I will shortly give you some ideas about now in the following. So the empirical setup in this paper follows this general idea, but it is a little bit different in the precise implementation and a little bit different in the specific measures. We also used the German part of the SILS data here, but this is now a longitudinal approach. We use the longitudinal network information in the SILS study. We had in the first two waves the extended measure of these sociometrics in the classrooms, and there are 140 classrooms which we can follow between wave 1 and wave 2, and we took all the classrooms where we witnessed at least 10 respondent students. And what we did now, and some of these things I regret a little bit with hindsight, because maybe we otherwise should have specified some even closer to the paper I mentioned before, but that's the way it is now. We have now, with respect to groups, we decided to focus on religion, and we in general decided, because this is really a huge computational effort behind estimating these models. We tried to keep it as simple as ever possible, knowing that this is substantively very questionable at some point. So we focused on religion and very basic, just a distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim students we have in the classroom. We have also a simpler measure of diversity. We just look at the proportion of Muslims, but which is very, usually these Herfindahl-based measures very strongly correlate with simply the proportion of ethnic minority groups. And for cohesion, we looked at a measure that Tom suggested, that's the average reciprocated degree. That means the average friendship choices which are reciprocated by the other part, and that is just simply taken as the average, and this is our macro measure of cohesion in this classroom. And basically, we have it in two sub-measures. One, looking at the majority group, which in this case is the non-Muslim group, and one looking at the overall minority group, which is the Muslim group in this. And on the x-axis, we have here the proportion of Muslims. And what we find if we take this in the classroom, and if we take this measure, we find, I mean, the figures are, the cases are, I think it is safe to make statements up to this proportion of 50%, that we say, okay, in the up to 50%, there's a clear decline of this cohesion integration measure with the proportion of Muslims in the classroom. And the interesting thing is that this holds as well as for the majorities, that means the non-Muslims, where this is kind of intuitive when we follow the ethnic homophily argument, but it also holds for the minority, the Muslim group itself, and that is kind of puzzling. And this is what we then took as the starting questions for the empirical analysis. The question is, how can we deeper understand now this macro relation? So put very, very specific and very clearly, the first question is, why is the average number of within classroom reciprocated friends for non-Muslim students declining as the function of a proportion of Muslims? Or to put it even more specifically, we could say, why is this regression coefficient minus 0.95? And this, the explanation would be intuitively that this has something to do with homophily. So that is something which we maybe would even expect, but it is still in need for a more solid statistical backup. And the other question is more puzzling. Why is also the respective number for the Muslim students declining as a function of a proportion? And this is not so intuitive, but maybe, and that is the general, it's also why I showed you the other study before, that could now be maybe a result of very complex interactions, and the answer could be similar, counterintuitive, maybe like in the former study. And the question is here, how can we approach this methodologically? So what we use is, and what I already mentioned, is this multi-level network analysis with Siena. This is done, and the basic idea of this stochastic actor-oriented model is that we kind of assume an agent-based model in the background, which drives the process, that actors make friendship choices after each other over time. And what we have here, we have given that we have panel network data, we can now here use the situation in wave 1 as given. We use the wave 2 as the dependent network, which should be explained by this stochastic actor-oriented model now. And what is theoretically assumed is that networks now change, that actors repeatedly make decisions about withdrawing ties which exist in wave 1, which to create new ties which did not exist in wave 1, or to decide that the ties are unchanged. In brackets, there is an extension, and many of the people who are attending here have worked on these kind of models. One could even extend this idea now that the actors could only change attributes, for example, attitudes or behavior, kinds of behavior, and that leads to the subgroup of models of coevolution, where we can study the network evolution and the evolution of behavior or attitudes simultaneously over time. and, for example, also disentangle processes of selection and processes of influence. That's not part of this model here. Here we look only at the network development. We assume that the choices, these micro steps, these choices are then made according to a generalized linear model, where we have the likelihood of making such a change expressed by a function, which includes attributes of the current network, attributes of the actors, or attributes of the ties between the actors. This all is implemented in the R-Siena package, and this R-Siena package now also offers a multi-level version where we can handle this large number of classrooms. And there is the simplest version is here the multi-group option that assumes that whatever we assume now is the same for all classrooms, and that the models are specified in the same way with the same coefficients for all the classrooms. And this is how the estimate here for in our specification look like. I don't think we don't really have to go in each of these details. It's just, I think it is more important to have a general impression of how this works and of how this can be understood. So these are the parameter estimates here for this multi-group estimation. And what we find, for example, let me explain for those who are not so deeply in these network measures what this means. This out degree is a general tendency to make ties at all. It's kind of a constant in this model. We have a tendency for reciprocity. That means an effect of, if I have been chosen by another actor, I will more likely choose him as my friend also. And we see that this reciprocity, this natural balancing mechanism, or this natural tendencies in networks in general, is a very strong force when we say, okay, how can we explain that a specific network configuration exists? A tendency to close triplets. Friends of friends are more likely to be my friends. Another set of other network effects, which I don't think is necessary to explain them in detail. But there is also here one measure, for example, of whether it matters that it is more likely that two people of the same gender choose a network, choose friendship to befriend each other, or whether a different religion has an impact of making friendship choices. And we see that there is, of course, also some homophily coefficient here, expressed here by the fact that being different means a more negative likelihood to make friendship choices. So maybe if you are interested in the details, we can go to this in the discussion. The important point, that's the fit now of the model, is with all the micro assumptions and all the assumptions of how the actor choices are then influenced by these effects. And that's a crucial part here, is then we try to check whether this micro assumptions and this fit of these micro assumptions of this model really are able to explain the macro phenomenon, the macro effect of the macro correlation that we had observed before. And the way Tom suggested to do this is to simulate with the fitted parameters of this first model, to simulate now 1,000 classrooms and to look whether the empirical coefficient, which is here for the minority, the coefficients for the minority and for the majority that we have seen before, how well they are captured by these simulated, by the distribution of these simulated classrooms. And what we find here is that, yeah, it's kind of, yeah, acceptable for the majority regression coefficient we have witnessed, but it is not really sufficient to this model to understand why we observe this correlation for the minority group overall. So, and then, okay, comes a technical innovation of Tom. He said, okay, let's try this with not with a fixed effect model, assuming that all classroom effects are the same for all the classrooms, but let's try it with a random coefficient version of this longitudinal multi-level approach. And this is something he developed recently and also implemented in this package. And these are now the random coefficient versions of these former model specification. And without going into detail, when we compare them, they are roughly similar, but not in each case. Some of the effects are now more pronunciated than before. I leave this undiscussed further here. But what we then find is that if we use this random coefficient model, then it is much more acceptable to say that these micro effects that we saw in this model are really able to account for the macro correlation that we observed, because now the empirical estimates here lie in an acceptable range of the overall distribution of the regression coefficients when we simulate these classrooms. But then we unfortunately Tom made one further step and said, okay, maybe we should look not only at the pure correlation, because this fitting of the model
Frank,
is.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I think
1 minute. So I'm coming.
Okay, perfect.
That's the second last slide. Thank you. I was seeing that you were kind of said, okay, let's look at another fit statistic, not look at the overall regression coefficient, but let's look at a less forgiving goodness of fit statistic. And this is now, if you try to do the same thing for the partial correlation, controlling also for the number of cases and other structural things, then we see that again we find, okay, we have this micro model is sufficient still to explain what we observe for the majority group, but we are certainly in need for better explanations to understand what we observe for the minority group. And that's the general logic, and that is also something which then leads me, and let me come to the summary and the conclusion. So first, what I think is important to stress here, that this is a methodological contribution mainly by Tom here, where we combine in this paper several strands that have all been done before, but not in this combination. So there have been studies by Knecht which did very sophisticated, which did not focus on micro-macro relations explicitly. We did, Hanno and I, 2015, this study, which doesn't really use an integrated model of network analysis. Other papers are very abstract of Snyder's and Stiglitz and not guided really by empirical questions. So I think this, and then finally we have this random coefficient contribution of Tom here, which is the methodological side with some second thoughts. I think that we see immediately that there are some specifications which could now be refined and should be refined. Maybe the measure for social cohesion could be better, also the specification of the model. But I think this is extremely difficult to estimate what we see here. Tom was running this overnights, in two or 3 days. He was telling me that this is very long in terms of computational time. I think it's also not the last word on the included substantive issues, and as I was very defensive here, so I think this should rather be not so much understand substantively, but as a methodological contribution to demonstrate how, in general, the general fruitfulness of the approach looks like, and what the possibilities and still the limitation of this kind of approach are. Thank you very much for being so patient, even 5 minutes longer. I stop here. Thanks.